Shalom, friends. Speaking to you from the Gilboa Mountains in northern Israel. Very, very beautiful. So we don't have any drushas from the Piaseczner Rebbe for Parshat Truma. Let's talk about that for a minute. The drushot that we call Eish Kodesh or drushot Mishnot Za'am, the drushot given in the Warsaw Ghetto. So some of the times when there's a gap in drushot, we know why there was a gap. That the Rebbe will say, he once says, I was very sick with typhus, couldn't speak for a few weeks. Once he says, I was in hiding. We know that after his son died, he didn't speak for almost 2 months. Things like that. And then there are times when we just don't have. We don't know if he didn't give, or if for some reason maybe he wasn't able to write it down in Motzi Shabbos what he did give. But so that's that in terms of that. In terms of the drashot in Derech HaMelech, the drashot from before the war, from the 20s and 30s, which is a massive amount of material, there's tons of weeks with no drashot at all. In fact, the entire Sefer Vayikra, there's only one drasha for Parshat Tzav. That's all there is. There's nothing for any of the other parshot. So that's because that's really hit and miss. Those were drashot that his Talmidim would write down after Shabbos based on their notes, or that it may be copied over his notes, and it was only what was brought by people to Israel before the Holocaust pretty much that was saved. And so that's really is kind of hit and miss. So in any event, it's not so surprising that we don't have a drasha for everything, but the question is what then to talk about. So it just popped into my mind to mention a theme in one of the early entries in the Rebbe's diary, Tzav Ziruz, about how to work on ourselves, on our midot, on our character traits, which we know is considered to be a very, very difficult thing to do. In the Musar movement, I think they say, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter would say that it's harder to change one character trait than it is to learn the whole Talmud backwards and forwards. But be that as it may, there's different approaches to how to deal with that. And the Rebbe mentions there, he mentions a couple of things. Maybe it's in more than one entry. One place he talks about old, probably not that old, but certainly an adult Hasid who came to him and talked about how he was having, very bad temptations as an adult, and said to him, I thought that as I got to be older, my Yetzer Hara, my evil inclination, would calm down, would be easier to fight it, and I see that it's not easy to fight it. It's just, it's still really terribly difficult. And the Rebbe says the reason that is because all the years this person just controlled their bad inclinations and desires, their bad midot, their bad traits, and didn't really deal with them from the root, didn't deal with them on a deep level. And therefore, paradoxically, when the person was young and energetic and strong, they could overcome their desires. But now that they're older and weaker, they have more trouble fighting back when the Yetzer Hara, when the evil inclination tempts them. And in the same place, or maybe in a different one, I don't have this farm with me right now, he talks about the idea that a person who's just learned to control their bad traits but hasn't dealt with them on the internal level, which I think in some of the Musar approaches is related to, learning how to keep your anger under control. And the Rebbe also talks about that in Chovad Talmidim, learning how to keep your ego under control. But there's a deeper level of how to deal with the root issues, the way the Maharal talks about things in Nitivot Olam. So the Rebbe says, for example, a person who's really has violent tendencies and has learned to control themselves so that they don't act upon their violent tendencies, he said, is kind of like, this is going to sound pretty harsh, it's kind of like a murderer who's in jail. Because a murderer who's in jail can't murder anyone. Does that mean that he's now a good person? He would love to murder people. As soon as they let him out of jail, he'd murder the first person he came across or the first person that angered him. He's not really reformed. He's just tied up. So he says a person who's just control their character traits is like a murderer who's tied up. So they can't act on their bad desires. But the whole goal of being a Hasid is to really transform yourself internally. And that comes back to all the avodat machshava, the thought work and the meditative work and all the various kinds of exercises, spiritual and mystical and educational exercises that the Rebbe's books are filled with for a person to learn how to undergo an inner transformation, which, by the way, some of the Musar schools do talk about a conversion, converso. Rav Shagar discusses it in the last chapter in Shuvi Nafshi. So what the Rebbe is really telling us is, obviously, it's better to control your anger than to act on it. It's better to control your ego than to let it run wild and turn into a big balgaiva, a big haughty person. But that's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to have an inner transformation where you cease to be angry. And to do that requires the work of, first of all, knowing why you're angry. The Rebbe says, I think in Tovada Talmidim, sometimes we're angry because we have a big ego and we don't think anyone else is good enough for us, so we have no patience for them. On the other hand, the anger could be as a result of having really, really low self-esteem and not having a healthy self-esteem, and that's what makes us feel bad about ourselves, and then we get angry. So if you want to really deal with your anger, for example, it requires deep inner work of self-analysis to understand what it is the root cause of my anger. And by dealing with the root cause, then the anger itself will no longer be so prominent in my life, for example. So a lot to think about, a lot to try to apply into our own lives. Each one of us knows what are those things we need to work on. May we have wonderful tidings, Bezrat Hashem, and a Shabbat Shalom, and Chodesh Tov, Chodesh Adar, full of Simcha, full of salvation for Am Yisrael, V'na'afochu, everything should turn around for the good. Kol Tuv, take care.